Hey everybody, before we get to the meat of today's show, I'm going to serve up a little appetizer for you here and tell you about another libertarian podcast, another great podcast out there, hosted by our friends over at Good Morning Liberty, also known as Nate and Charlie. And of course, there's been some talk and some rumors and some things swirling about name mispronunciations, and they might have called me Jack. I might have called Nate Nick. None of that matters. None of that matters at all. What matters is the awesome show they deliver multiple days a week. It's a 5-day per week podcast. They have an awesome segment coming up at the end of the week called the Dumb Bleep of the Week, and it is hilarious. It's a can't miss. It's one of those segments that, even if you're not listening to every episode, you got to tune back in. You don't miss the dumb bleep. So check out Good Morning Liberty. Go subscribe to their podcast, Good Morning Liberty. Check it out today with Nate and Charlie.
We are born free, and we will die free. The time in between, though, that's complicated. In that time, governments, institutions, and our egos will limit our ability to find true freedom in this life. These are real stories of real people overcoming the odds, persevering in justice, and unlocking their potential. Welcome to Finding Freedom. Here's your host, John Odermatt.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Finding Freedom right here on the Lions of Liberty podcast. And guys, I'm excited for you to hear from today's guest. Got another great guest for you. And, diving back into the criminal justice side of the swimming pool this week. So, it's things can get choppy. Things can get a little bit rough. But these stories are stories that need to be told. And I will never shy away from telling these stories. When I changed the name to Finding Freedom from Felony Friday, it didn't mean I was abandoning the criminal justice system. It just meant that I was broadening the show and the things I'd be looking at. But still, the focus of this show is exposing injustice and giving a platform to those people who have been trampled by the state, been trampled by corporations, been trampled by the man, a stage, a platform to share that story, to get the word out so other people are able to relate to another human being, a human face, and in the story that they're telling. So excited for y'all to hear it. Just one note before we get rolling here today. If you guys just stumbled across this show, which would be amazing, you're listening to my voice right now, just in randomness, but if you did, this is what we have here. It's a bit of a variety program. We have 3 shows per week. On Monday, we have our program hosted by Mark Claire. It's our longest running show that we have. It's mostly interviews, also some debates, getting into philosophy, entrepreneurship, application, things like that. On Wednesday, we have Electric Liberty Land hosted by Brian McWilliams. It's more of a current events-based show, but I will say that Brian has been doing a fantastic job with interviews lately, and I've been enjoying listening to those. And of course, this show, Finding Freedom, every Thursday. Please subscribe where you subscribe, or I guess on Apple Podcasts, it's now follow. Apple Podcasts has made it they've made it difficult to follow podcasts. It used to be this big button that you would hit to subscribe. Now up in the upper right-hand corner, it's this little tiny circled plus sign. You got to put your finger sideways to just barely touch it to follow the podcast so you get it downloaded to your phone. So go ahead. If you're listening on an iPhone or an Apple Podcast, go do that. Do the sideways finger thing to get our shows delivered to your phone. We appreciate it. You'll appreciate it. Everybody wins, guys. It's mutually beneficial for everyone involved. Enjoy today's show. Let's get to it. My guest today on Finding Freedom is filmmaker Jia Wertz. Jia is a graduate of New York Film Academy. She directed a very important documentary called Conviction, which I just watched a couple days ago. And in it, she investigated flaws and inconsistencies in the criminal justice system through the story of Jeffrey Deskovic. We'll talk more about his case. Very fascinating and troubling case in a lot of ways. In addition, Jia is a featured writer for Forbes. She's the co-host of the Speaking of Crime podcast, a founder and fashion designer for Studio 15. Jia, welcome to Finding Freedom.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. And as we were just talking about in the pre-show chat, I just was saying how much I enjoyed your documentary, and I think it is very important that people watch it. So I'll just give a plug at the top for it and say, people can go to Amazon Prime and watch that. It's called Conviction. You can search it and find it. And we'll obviously talk more about it. We'll get to that a little later in the show. Before we get to that, though, could you tell my audience a little bit about your background, a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I am Canadian, and I now live in New York City with my husband and son. I spent 20 years working in the fashion industry, and realized 20 years in that I didn't really enjoy doing that anymore. And that's when I switched careers to go into filmmaking. And I'll tell you, I'm sure later on how I ended up in filmmaking, but I was really searching for a way to help this cause, people who've been wrongfully convicted. And I really couldn't figure it out because I didn't want to go to law school. And I thought about doing a podcast about it years ago. And when I talked to Jeff, actually, over coffee one day and asked him, for someone who'd been in your position, who'd been wrongfully convicted of a crime, what would help the most? Like what somebody who's, just an average person, what could we do? And I asked him if podcasts would help. And he said, no, by the time a podcast helps somebody, it's going to be a lot of time will have passed. And so I was just trying to, figure out what to do. And that led me to filmmaking.
Well, let's talk about it. A lot of interesting stuff there. I want to go back to what you said. So you left your previous career in fashion and went down this different path. I'm just asking this selfishly because I'm kind of in a similar position. I do have a day job where I do some things in the energy sector, and I have other projects and businesses that I work in, and I'm looking to transition myself. So, can you just talk about a little bit about that chapter in your life and how that was for you?
Yeah, absolutely. It happened a little bit organically for me because I had my son. And so I was on, maternity leave and at home for a while. And so I was already not working at my previous job. And that gave me the time to kind of reassess and think like, do I want to go back to that? Do I really still like that? Am I still passionate about it? And the answer was no. Mm-hmm. And back when I was like 19, 20 years old, I had read this book, Reuben Carter's book, The 16th Round.
Yes, I've read it.
Yes. Have you? It's
such
a good book. That book just stuck with me. It left a mark. And so that's what first intrigued me into the whole wrongful conviction world. Mm-hmm. And that, I was so young then, I just read it and I was kind of shaken. I didn't know that law enforcement could be the bad guys back then. I didn't know that was something that occurred. And then fast forward to 2014, I heard the Serial podcast and I felt the same way all over again for the subject of that podcast, Adnan Syed. And by that time I was, mid-30s, and that made me really question what I wanted to do and how I could help. And so it kind of happened organically. I was on maternity leave. I had listened to Serial and I really wanted to help. And I thought, I got some time on my hands. What could I do to help this guy? So I planned a fundraiser in New York City. We got some local musicians together. We sold tickets. We got a space in the basement of this pub in the Upper West Side. And we had this little event and we ended up raising a few $1,000s for Adnan's legal defense fund. And that was kind of my first taste of, doing something in this world. And while I was planning that event, my friend who I was planning it with said, we should have a speaker because neither of us are experts on wrongful conviction. And I said, absolutely, we should. And she said, I happened to meet a guy at a party and he has a really similar story to Adnan. He was also 16 and in high school and wrongfully convicted of a murder of a classmate. And I said, yeah, absolutely. I got to meet him and he'd be great. And we met him and he ended up being the speaker at our event. And that's how I met Jeff. And wow. Through the fundraiser, I became friends with Adnan's family and I'm still friends with them today. And they're just the most wonderful people. And through staying in touch with them, I happened to be at Adnan's post-conviction hearing. And at that post-conviction hearing, there was a camera crew. The camera crew was filming the HBO doc, The Case Against Adnan Syed. And when I learned that that's what they were filming, and I was completely naive, had no experience in filmmaking whatsoever, there was 3 people there. It was like maybe even 2 people. I'm not sure. It was a cameraman and a producer for sure, and maybe a third person. And they were filming. And I thought in my naive mind that 3 people were making an HBO doc. So I was like, oh, I got this. I can get 3 friends together. And so I promptly, that's what led me to filmmaking. And that's when I realized that filmmaking is something that I would want to do. And I went home and enrolled into New York Film Academy to kind of learn about it.
That is that whole story. It's so amazing in so many different ways, because a lot of people, myself included, in that same situation, would have just kind of like stopped and been like, wait, can I do this? Can I start a fundraiser here to help for this? And you just did it. When you saw them filming, a lot of people would say, well, I should probably look into how much that costs and see if I really can do it. Nope. You just decided to start pursuing it, which is awesome. I mean, we need more of that in this world. That's phenomenal. So you met Jeffrey because he was the speaker at that fundraiser, and I'm assuming was that the first time you were introduced to his story?
Yes, I had never heard a story before. That was the first time. And I had never met anyone in real life who'd been wrongfully convicted. I had only read Reuben Carter's book. And then I had watched the Denzel Washington movie, The Hurricane, that was based on Reuben Carter's book. And then I listened to Serial. And then I met Jeff. And so when I went to film school, he was the only person I knew personally that had been through this. So he was the only person I reached out to say, hey, do you want to, I'm thinking of making a documentary. Would you be interested in being the subject? And he was down. And so we started filming and stuff while I was still in school. But yeah, that was my first introduction to Jeff and his story.
So let's talk a little bit about Jeff's case. I don't want to give it away because people should watch it, but maybe if you can just give just a high level kind of teaser of his case in the documentary.
Yeah, for sure. Jeff was a high school student at the age of 16 in Peekskill, New York, and it was a really safe town. I think, if I'm not mistaken, for 2 decades, there was no major crime like homicide or anything like that. And then this one day, this girl, a classmate, Angela Correa, was murdered. And the entire town was really shaken up because it was such a safe place to live, and just things like that didn't really happen in that town. And the police were under pressure to solve it, obviously. And unfortunately, they came to Jeff's school to, of course, interview students. And some of the students said that they should look into Jeff because Jeff was a quiet kid at school. And they said he didn't really fit in. And so they thought he was odd or what have you. And so they said, look into Jeff. And that's what got
because that's what murderers are. They're all just quiet kids. Like,
I know, then we were all murderers, I guess, because I was a quiet
I was
kid.
very quiet in school.
Me too. And awkward and all of those things. Yes, same. So unfortunately, that sequence of events, that's how they began. And then the detectives just kind of got tunnel vision, and they ended up charging Jeff with the crime, and he got convicted, and he spent quite almost 2 decades in prison for this murder he didn't commit.
And they didn't have really any evidence. I mean, they couldn't have because he didn't do it. So
yeah, and the crazy thing is they had no evidence against Jeff except for, kind of students saying he was, that's not even evidence. That's just all they had to go on. They had a police did like how they do criminal profiles of who they think is most likely to have committed the crime. And whatever profile it was that the NYPD came up with, Jeff matched that profile. We know now after the fact that profile was completely incorrect because, obviously Jeff didn't do it. But yeah, it was a bizarre sequence of events, but the evidence they did have, which was DNA, because unfortunately Angela was raped and murdered. So there was DNA, and it didn't match Jeff, but they didn't even, really use what they had to find the right person.
So this was, how long ago was this that the actual crime occurred?
89, I believe.
So 89. So DNA evidence was not nearly as advanced as it is today, but at that point in time, they still could have determined it wasn't Jeff, right? Look, so they did. They knew the DNA they had did not match Jeff.
Yeah, I don't know these people, so I obviously it's my opinion, but it seems that they knew it wasn't Jeff, but they still wanted to pin it on it because there was a lot of questionable things that happened during the court case and with the medical examiner and with the detective and the coerced false confession. Police, if they really wanted to solve it, wouldn't be feeding information to somebody. They would definitely be holding information back to see what this person knows, to find out if this suspect has information that they wouldn't otherwise have if they weren't at the scene of the crime. And so they fed Jeff a lot of information. They even took him to the crime scene and walked him through it so that he would know what had happened, so that later on they could tap into that and make him repeat it during the false confession and whatnot.
Yeah, I've interviewed people in the past, expert witnesses in false confessions.
Yeah.
And, a lot of people, when they hear someone made a confession, like, well, why would somebody admit to something that they didn't do? And you get in a position, well, one of the things that can happen, lots of different things. One thing can happen, whereas you're realizing, wow, I mean, they're even though I didn't do this, I'm going to end up going to prison. I have to make the best deal possible. I don't know if that's exactly what happened with Jeff, or if he was just so confused he didn't know up from down or what was going on. I mean, a young kid who was 16 years old. More than that.
Yes, he was 16 years old. His mom was a single mom. His dad was never in his life. She had told him not to talk to the police. And being 16, naive, obviously, and trusting the police, the detectives had told him that he could help with the case. And so they had kind of groomed him for over a month, taking him around saying, oh, help us with the case. What do you know? And so Jeff thought that he was actually helping the police, and his childhood dream was to be a cop. So he thought, oh, look at this opportunity to work with real police officers, and they're asking for my help. And it made him feel, important and stuff. And they knew what they were doing. But unfortunately, Jeff thought that he was really helping them. And so that's how it all happened. And being 16, Jeff did not tell his mom that he was talking to them because she had specifically said not to. And so when they took him out of county lines to interrogate him the day of the false confession, nobody knew where he was. He didn't have a lawyer. His mom didn't know where he was. He just went with the police officers willingly, and they took him somewhere where he didn't know where he was. He hadn't eaten any food. They interrogated him for 7 hours. He was hungry, and he'd never drank coffee in his life. They gave him numerous cups of coffee for the entire 7 hours. He said he was jittery and confused and really scared. Yeah. Right. Yeah. He said he was I asked him this. I said, why did you confess? And he said, I didn't see any way out. Any other way out. He said, they told me that if I just said I did it, they would take me home. And he's like, after 7 hours, he was like, I just want to go home.
That's so sad. And he ends up,
it's so sad,
spending 16 years in prison. Right. And eventually the DNA evidence leads to the actual killer, who in the time that he was out, killed another woman. So at least, I mean, I guess one that's proven, maybe more, who knows? So, I mean, it's just so, our criminal justice system is so broken, and it's not broken just to the point where, it's causing, obviously, the people who are in prison for wrong convictions or for these, stupid, nonviolent drug crimes, people getting locked away for decades for stuff like that. But it's the collateral damage of it all. It's affecting in so many different directions. Innocent bystanders are getting caught up in the blowback from it. So when you think of false, I'm getting false confessions and
I do that.
Wrongful convictions mixed up. But so this case with Jeff was the first one you looked into, and you created this documentary. Have you gotten interested and started to investigate and look at other ones out there?
I have. So right now I'm working on the feature-length documentary of Jeff's story. And so I'm almost finished that. I'm in post-production on that. And now I'm researching cases for my third documentary. And so I'm actually in that phase right now. And it's a tough thing to decide, whose case to cover. And it's also a tough thing to determine if the person whose story you want to cover is actually innocent. It's, I guess, how do I know, really?
Yeah. So what do you base that on when you start looking into a case? What are you looking for? Are you actually meeting with the person, or? What's the
Yeah,
process?
so I haven't met with anybody. Right now, I'm just in the research phase. But what's really interesting is that I've been working with people like Jeff's organization and like the Innocence Project, because I interviewed a lot of people from the Innocence Project for my documentary about Jeff. And what I've learned is that there's these kind of markers that indicate whether someone is most likely innocent or not. And that's been really fascinating for me to learn. You probably know this already, but some of those things are when people who have been in prison for some time are up for parole. Most often, people who are innocent maintain their innocence in front of the parole board.
Mm-hmm.
And the parole board will consider, release and whatnot if you show remorse and say you're sorry for what you did and you're a changed person and you're, going to be a functional member of society and stuff like that. But people who are innocent, even after spending, decades in prison, maintain their innocence when they could simply pretend they have remorse just so they could finally get out of this place that they shouldn't be in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't do that. They assert their innocence because that's so important to them, because they know it's not true that they didn't commit this crime. And so interestingly enough, that's one indicator of innocence.
And there's also another thing with that is just the pressure from being in prison. And it might even make your life a little easier in prison, relating to, the other people that you're with, if you have committed the crime. And then you kind of have that, it's kind of, I don't want to say like bragging rights, but it's a way to relate. It puts you on the same level. When you're saying, I'm not like you, I didn't commit, a terrible crime.
Yes.
It creates separation. So
I'm sure that's the case. I mean, of course, I don't know, but it makes sense because you also you're in a place that's full of dangerous people,
mm-hmm.
and you don't want to be the only not dangerous person amongst all these dangerous criminals, of course. Yeah, I'm sure.
Absolutely. So just to go back to Jeff's case, one thing that really stuck out to me, which I'd never really thought about before, and I think this is the case not only with wrongful convictions, but people convicted of crimes at young ages who do decades in prison. And I hadn't really heard anyone really talk about it this way, but it really makes sense. When Jeff was talking about, he's in his 40s now, and he's saying, I feel like I'm in my 20s. And I feel like I should be going out to, baseball games and playing sports and doing these different things. And there's nobody his age to do it with. So really, I mean, when you think of how this really compounds in the many different ways that this has affected his life, very sad, but also I think a lot to learn from it, wherein people who have loved ones who have been to prison, I think it can be helpful for them to see a story like Jeff's, to see him being so honest. Because I mean, I've done, I want to say like 200 interviews with people who've been to prison. I haven't heard anyone talk about it that way.
Yeah, it was so interesting. It's so heartbreaking and almost heartwarming at the same time. And because he is free, that's the only reason. But so interesting. And it's true. I mean, Jeff is like I interviewed his best friend, and she said that he's like a little kid inside. She's like, he's like still 16 on the inside. She's like, he has his like work Jeff, and then the personal, like when you're friends with him, Jeff. And she said he's silly and he's like a kid. And I can see how that could be, because all those years got stolen from him, and they're formative years, and you had to spend those years in prison, not growing the way you should, not making the relationships that you should, not going through the everyday life to life, day-to-day things that you should be going through.
So when it comes to wrongful convictions as a whole, we talked about in Jeff's case how, it seemed like the police officers were, maybe intentionally, like they might have known, the investigators might have known it wasn't Jeff, but they still proceed down this path. I've seen many cases with prosecutors when they for sure know that they are, putting someone who's innocent in prison, but they're still continuing with it. And then once they're in prison and there's appeals, they're still putting up that stone wall, not letting them out. Do you think that this is a systematic problem, or do we have a problem where, we just have, like they say with police officers, like you have bad apples that get into this? Or what's your thoughts on that?
I have two thoughts on that. I think that as far as the detectives and whatnot, there's bad apples. That's what I think. I mean, I'm not an expert, but that's what I have seen. That's what I think, that there's bad apples, unfortunately. And it seems there's even just bad entire police force or one station, whoever's running it. Like if it's allowed, then that becomes the culture that is fostered in that, one police station or however they're divided up. But I think the systemic problem is that a lot of detectives, prosecutors have immunity, and there's no consequences for their behavior. And if there were consequences, and if they actually treated these actions that result in wrongful convictions, where it's on purpose, where it's coerced confessions or planting evidence or what have you, things like that that's a crime. And it should be treated as such. They should have no immunity. And if they were treated that way, they would think twice about doing it, because they don't want to end up in prison. They know what it's like. They put people there. So I think that's the bigger issue.
I'm really glad you brought that up. And last summer, when there were the BLM protests, and there was really a push for, taking away the qualified immunity that law enforcement has, and even looking at if there is a wrongful conviction, or if they are, either lying or fabricating evidence in order to lock someone up, that there should be ramifications. It shouldn't just be, oh, you get some paid leave, or even they get discharged from the force, but they're not getting criminal charges against them in any way, and they have their union pension to fall back on. So it's so difficult it seemed like there was all this momentum going towards police reform, and actually with a lot of energy behind it and funding behind it.
Yeah.
Has all that been lost? It seems like we lost it. It seems like nobody cares about that anymore.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that, but I agree with you. For sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm venting, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the thing that would make one of the things that would make the biggest impact and the biggest change to our system is if we had that, because it would be like a policing system in of itself, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the actual making of a documentary. So this was the first one you did, and so when did you finish your film school?
So I just took a workshop program. So I finished in, oh God, time is so weird right now because of COVID. I don't even know what year. I guess it was almost 2 years ago now that I finished. Yeah.
And then how long did it take you? So you mentioned earlier that there's the documentary that's out now on Amazon Prime. That's going to be made into what you're working on now, into a feature. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So the documentary short that's on Amazon Prime is just 21 minutes long. And it really focuses on what it was like for Jeff to reintegrate into society, and what it's like for an innocent person to come back into the world and regular world, and how they cope and what their life is like. The feature length documentary is Jeff's story, but an 1.5 hour long film. And it goes much more in depth. It covers everything the short covers, but it goes much more in depth into false confessions and why innocent people confess to things they didn't do. And why was the DNA not allowed to be tested at the time in Westchester County? Janine Pirro was the DA. And she denied the testing of that. Jeff had been requesting that DNA to be tested multiple times over years. And she's always denied the testing of that DNA. And, why did that happen? Why was that even allowed to happen in our justice system? And, if they had tested that DNA, Jeff could have saved, I think, almost 8 or 10 years off of his sentence. I mean, he could have really had a big chunk of his life back. And so it just goes more into depth into all of those things. I talked to his mom and family members and friends to see what it was like, the first day he got out, and everything he's done since, and even some of the stuff he's working on today, which is really, really interesting.
And did his mom and family members support him? Did they believe that he was innocent?
Yes, they did. They believed he was innocent the entire time. When I talked to his mom, when I interviewed her for the feature length film, she was like, I told him not to talk to the police. Like, I knew he didn't do it, and I told him to stay away from them, and she was, of course, a little frustrated because she was a single mom. She couldn't afford a lawyer. So they had to get a court appointed lawyer who wasn't very good, I guess. And she had a younger son. So she had another son. So she had to take care of her son, meanwhile trying to navigate, the whole situation with Jeff and the legal system and money and all of that. So, it was really, really hard on her.
Yeah. Well, that's another problem with the legal system is the people who don't have money to defend themselves really can't defend themselves because they're getting nothing against public defenders. I mean, a lot of them are, trying their hardest, doing the best they can, but they get overwhelmed with caseloads and they just don't have the time to put into it. So that's really one of the bigger inequalities there is just in the defense you can put up, and you're going against a prosecutor who has all the resources in the world that they could ever dream of to put up their case. So that's a huge problem.
Yes.
So when does the feature come out? Do you know that, or is there a release date planned?
So the release was planned for this year, but COVID really put a wrench in all of that. Mm-hmm. We have 2 shoots left to do. The film is in post-production. We're almost finished, but we were supposed to shoot inside the prisons. And as you probably know, all the prisons got shut down for all visitors because of the pandemic. And so we haven't had a chance to do that shoot yet still. And then one more where I need to travel to Colorado. And of course, with, not really flying and all of that, I haven't done that yet either. So as soon as we can get those 2, I'm hoping now that it would be beginning of next year for a release, but maybe end of this year. If things open up and we can just knock out these shoots, then maybe even the end of this year.
All right. One more question, and it's not a trick question, but it's something I've been asking recently. I've been getting good responses to it. So I'll ask people who've written books or created, films like yourself. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you really wanted to talk about that's really important to the film or about yourself?
Oh, that's a good question. That is a good question, but I'd have to put some thought into that. I don't think so, though. Not off the top of my head. Okay. No.
And can you just plug the documentary, the short again, and talk about where people can find out more about you, either your social media, websites, all that good stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Conviction is on Amazon Prime. You can search the word conviction or Jeffrey Deskovic or Jia Wertz, and you should see it there. And as far as myself, you can find me on my website. It's just my full name, jiawertz.com. And the great thing is actually...
And that's Jia with a J.
Yes, Jia with a J. It's JIAWERTZ.com. I was going to tell you, yes. So one interesting thing I will share is that, right after I finished at New York Film Academy, we got into a few film festivals, and I was so excited because it was my first film, nor did I think that was going to happen or it was even a possibility. And then, we got into over 10 festivals, and I was very excited because our theatrical premiere was going to be in New York City at the Anthology Film Archives Theater, which to me was like just iconic. And I was over the moon. And that's when the pandemic hit. And 2 weeks before the release, all of the theaters shut down. And so we never got to have a theatrical release. We went straight to Amazon Prime eventually. And so what's really exciting, and why I mentioned it when I mentioned my website, is we have a tab there for screenings, and everybody is welcome to come if there's one in your city. And the one in New York and the one in Los Angeles are now being rescheduled since they never happened a year and a half ago. So yeah, and there'll be other cities as well that we're going to be having some screenings in. So anybody that wants to come, I would love to have them there and meet them in person.
Awesome. It's very exciting. Well, Jia Wertz, thank you for coming on the show, and thank you for all you're doing to reform the criminal justice system.
Thank you for having me. This is great.
All righty. Thank you. Hope you all enjoyed that interview on Finding Freedom. Another awesome guest. And hopefully you guys also have subscribed to the Lions of Liberty podcast, and you're getting all 3 of our unique shows in your little listening device delivered to your ears. If you haven't, please do that. Just go to your app, you know how to do it, and subscribe. You can also leave us a 5-star review and a nice comment. We would prefer if you did it on Apple Podcasts, but anywhere you can on the internet, please leave us a positive comment. Also, if you want to support us, we would love that too. Please go to patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. You can support us for as little as a couple bucks, or if you get in at a higher level, you get merchandise and access to us, and all the way up to you can advertise on the show or get to even produce a show. So check it all out, patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. And if you haven't checked it out yet, please consider checking out the Lions of Liberty store, where we have some awesome t-shirts. We have a Taxation is Death t-shirt with an awesome design. We have a Wax On, Tax Off t-shirt. And we're always coming up with new ideas and adding new t-shirt designs to the store. Check that out at lionsofliberty.store. And if you're in the Pride, you get a discount on anything you buy in the store. So you do both of those things and you win. That's all I got, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. This is John Odermatt signing off. Always remember to keep your head up and the fires of liberty burning.